Washington, D.C., 2:17 a.m. The city was drenched in silence, the kind that felt unnatural, like the world was holding its breath. A siren howled somewhere in the distance before fading into nothingness. Then, 3 sharp knocks shattered the stillness. Cassandra Wilson's eyes snapped open. A wave of adrenaline surged through her as she sat up in bed, breath coming fast and shallow. The knocks came again, harder this time. Then, a voice. Deep. Commanding. Washington, D.C. Police Department. Open up immediately. Her heart slammed against her ribs. There was no reason for the police to be at her door, none that she could think of. She reached for her phone, but before she could grab it, the lock gave way. The door swung open. Blinding flashlights. Heavy boots pounding against the hardwood floor. Figures in dark uniforms, helmets concealing their faces. Ms. Wilson, hands behind your head. She blinked against the harsh light, struggling to process what was happening. One officer, tall and imposing, had a face carved from stone. Carter, Jonathan, his badge read. Beside him stood another officer, his grip tightening around a pair of handcuffs, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. Smith, Dillon. Both men were white. Both had the look of officers who already knew exactly how this was going to end. What's going on? Her voice wavered, her breathing shallow. What am I being accused of? Carter's expression didn't change. Murder. The word hit her like a fist to the gut. Cassandra reeled. No, I haven't killed anyone. Smith shrugged. That's funny, because we have your fingerprints at the crime scene, a witness who saw you, and security footage placing you near the victim's apartment. Her world tilted. The walls pressed in. This isn't happening. This isn't real. I don't even know who you're talking about, she gasped, her voice cracking. You have the wrong person. Carter didn't answer. Instead, he gave a small nod to Smith, who stepped forward and snapped the cold steel cuffs around her wrists. As they dragged her outside, the night air bit at her skin. Lights flickered on in neighboring apartments. Faces peered from behind curtains and cracked blinds. No one spoke. No one stepped outside. The patrol car door slammed shut behind her, sealing her fate. The station smelled like stale coffee and disinfectant. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sickly glow over the interrogation room. A steel table, a single chair. The kind of room where people were broken down until they said what the police wanted to hear. Cassandra sat stiffly, her wrists still aching from the cuffs. Minutes dragged by before the door finally creaked open. A man in a dark suit stepped inside, moving with calculated precision. He pulled out the chair across from her and settled in, his expression unreadable. Detective Jacob Thomas. Unlike the officers who had arrested her, there was no smug satisfaction in his eyes, just cold, methodical observation. Ms. Wilson, he said, his voice calm but firm. Do you know why you're here? Cassandra clenched her jaw. I've been set up. I didn't kill anyone. Thomas exhaled slowly, as if he had heard the same defense 1,000 times before. He flipped open the case file and slid a stack of photographs toward her. Her stomach twisted. A body lay sprawled across a wooden floor, blood pooling beneath it. A gun rested inches away. The victim's face was frozen in horror. We have solid evidence, Thomas said, his tone measured. Your fingerprints on the weapon. A security camera placing you near the crime scene. A witness who saw you arguing with the victim hours before his death. Cassandra's breath hitched. I don't even know this person. Thomas studied her, his gaze searching. For deception. For weakness. Or maybe, for the truth. Behind the one-way glass, Carter and Smith watched, their expressions unreadable. Think Thomas will crack, Smith mused, arms crossed. Carter smirked. Doesn't matter. We've already won. Back in her holding cell, Cassandra sat motionless on the cold metal bench, her mind racing. None of this made sense. Then, like a bolt of lightning, realization struck. A week ago, she had been reviewing a case involving police misconduct. A handful of officers were under investigation for running a drug trafficking ring. Just days before her arrest, she had received classified documents about the probe. What if this wasn't about a murder at all? What if Carter and Smith weren't just arresting her? What if they were covering something up? Her pulse quickened. She had to find a way to reach someone on the outside, someone who could help her. But with no phone, no lawyer she could trust, her options were running thin. Then, an idea struck. Maybe proving her innocence wasn't the way to go. Maybe the key was making her accusers believe she had something on them. She took a slow, steady breath, then stepped up to the door of her cell and knocked firmly. "I want to speak to Detective Thomas. Now." Detective Thomas didn't respond right away. He sat across from Cassandra in the dimly lit interrogation room, fingers drumming lightly against the case file. His gaze was unreadable, but Cassandra could see something behind his eyes. Doubt, maybe, or curiosity. She leaned forward, keeping her voice steady. "You know something's off about this case." Thomas exhaled through his nose, flipping open the file again. "You're facing serious charges, Ms. Wilson. If you want me to listen, you'd better start giving me a reason." Cassandra met his gaze. "I was investigating police corruption. A week before my arrest, I received classified documents about an internal probe into a drug ring, one linked to your department." Thomas's jaw tensed. He glanced briefly toward the one-way mirror, where she knew Carter and Smith were watching. "You think your arrest is connected?" he asked. "I don't think," Cassandra said. "I know." Thomas didn't speak, but she saw the flicker of conflict in his expression. He knew something wasn't right. He just wasn't sure if he was willing to risk his career to prove it. Before he could respond, the door opened. Carter stepped in, his smirk firmly in place. "That's enough, Thomas. Wilson's done talking." Thomas looked at Carter, then back at Cassandra. Without another word, he closed the file and left. Carter lingered, watching her like a cat sizing up a cornered mouse. "You had a good run, Wilson, but you're out of moves." She held his gaze. "You sure about that?" For the first time, Carter's smirk faltered. Back in her cell, Cassandra replayed everything in her mind. Carter was rattled. That meant she was on the right track. A voice came from the next cell. "You're making them nervous." She turned her head. A man in his 50s, sharp-eyed and lean, watched her from behind the bars. "Who are you?" she asked. "Marcus Reed." He smirked. "And I know when someone's being set up." She frowned. "You're the hacker." "That's what they called me before they locked me up," he said. "I prefer whistleblower. But hey, labels." Cassandra hesitated. "Why do you care?" Reed shrugged. "Because I don't like seeing good people get buried for knowing too much." He leaned forward. "And because I have contacts on the outside." Cassandra's pulse quickened. "Contacts?" Reed nodded. "I can get a message out, but I need to know what you've got." She hesitated. If he was lying, she was done. But if he was telling the truth? Before she could decide, an officer appeared. "Wilson, you've got a phone call." Cassandra's stomach flipped. Who would be calling her? She was led into a small room, the corded phone waiting for her. She picked it up, her grip tight. A low voice on the other end. "You need to find the drive." Cassandra's blood ran cold. The drive. The one she had hidden before her arrest. The one with everything she needed to prove her innocence. The voice lowered. "Get to it before Carter and Smith do, or you're dead." The line went dead. Cassandra stared at the receiver, her mind racing. Someone else knew about the drive. And now, the clock was ticking. Audience engagement. Who do you think was on the other end of the call? A friend trying to help, or another player in this game? Drop your theories in the comments. Cassandra sat on the edge of her cot, the weight of the phone call pressing down on her. Someone knew about the drive. And if they knew, Carter and Smith did too. Across the corridor, Marcus Reed studied her, arms crossed. You gonna tell me what that was about? She hesitated. Every instinct screamed at her to be careful, but she was running out of time. I need to get to something before they do. Reed smirked. Then you better start thinking fast, because they're already moving. Before she could ask what he meant, heavy footsteps echoed down the hallway. Carter appeared outside her cell, his smirk more menacing than usual. Hope you're not getting too comfortable, Wilson. Clock's ticking. She forced herself to stay calm. That sounds like someone who's nervous. His smile didn't falter. Nervous? No, just making sure you know. Whatever you're thinking of doing, it's already too late. Then he was gone. Cassandra exhaled slowly. He was bluffing. He had to be. But what if he wasn't? That night, a fight broke out in the holding cells. Guards rushed in, chaos erupting around her. Cassandra pressed herself against the bars, watching as Reed slipped something into her cell, a small folded piece of paper. She grabbed it quickly, unfolding it under the dim light. Exit plan. Midnight. Be ready. Her pulse spiked. Reed was staging something. And she had a choice, stay and risk losing everything, or go all in. She tucked the paper into her sleeve and took a deep breath. She was getting out. The plan moved fast. At midnight, a distraction sent the guards scrambling. Reed gave her just enough of an opening to slip past her cell door. They moved quickly, navigating the dimly lit corridors, heartbeats pounding in unison. Just as they reached the side exit, voices erupted behind them. Hey, stop. Cassandra sprinted into the night, adrenaline coursing through her veins. Reed veered off in another direction, disappearing into the darkness. She didn't have time to look back. She had one destination. The drive. Cassandra sprinted through the darkened streets, her breath coming in sharp, controlled bursts. The city around her felt hostile. Every shadow a possible threat. Every passing car a potential tail. She couldn't stop. Not yet. The drive was still where she had hidden it. At least, she hoped it was. She turned a corner, slipping into a narrow alleyway. Her destination was just ahead. An old bookstore, closed for renovations. It had been the perfect hiding spot. But as she neared the back entrance, her stomach dropped. The door was ajar. Someone had beaten her here. She moved cautiously, pressing herself against the wall, listening. No voices, no movement, but she wasn't alone. Sliding through the entrance, she kept her steps light. The air inside was thick with dust, and faint moonlight spilled through a cracked window. The back office door stood slightly open. She edged forward, barely breathing, and pushed the door wider. A figure stood inside, back turned. Carter. The drive was in his hands. Looking for this? He drawled, turning to face her with a smug grin. Cassandra's pulse pounded. She forced herself to stay calm. You don't even know what's on that. Oh, but I do, Carter said. Enough to ruin a lot of people. And you actually thought we wouldn't find it. A slow clap echoed from the shadows. Smith stepped out, leaning against a desk. Gotta admit, Wilson, you put up a good fight. But this ends now. Cassandra's eyes darted to the window. An escape route. But she had seconds to act. She lunged. Carter moved fast, but she was faster. She twisted, knocking the drive from his grasp. It clattered to the floor. Smith lunged for it. A gun cocked. Step back, a voice commanded. Everyone froze. Detective Thomas stood in the doorway, gun raised, his expression stone cold. "It's over. Drop it." Carter's grip tightened. "You don't know what you're doing, Thomas." "I know exactly what I'm doing," Thomas said, stepping closer. "And so do you. You've lost." The tension in the air was suffocating. Then, sirens. Growing louder. Closer. Smith's smirk faded. "You called them." Thomas tilted his head. "Funny thing about justice. It has a way of catching up." For a long moment, no one moved. Then, Carter's jaw clenched. He let the drive fall to the ground. Cassandra exhaled, heart still hammering, as she scooped it up. Outside, flashing red and blue lights painted the streets. Officers stormed the building. Within seconds, Carter and Smith were in cuffs. Thomas turned to Cassandra, his voice low. "Make it count." She nodded, gripping the drive tightly. "I will." She stepped out into the night, feeling the weight of what came next. This wasn't just about clearing her name anymore. This was about taking down the whole system. Audience engagement. Did you expect Thomas to turn against Carter and Smith? What do you think Cassandra will do next? Let us know in the comments. Cassandra sat in a dimly lit cafe, her hands wrapped around a cup of cooling coffee. The drive sat on the table in front of her, small and unassuming, yet powerful enough to dismantle careers and expose an entire network of corruption. Across from her, Thomas leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "You sure about this? Once it's out there, there's no undoing it." Cassandra met his gaze. "That's the point. If I don't do this, they'll find another way to bury the truth." Thomas exhaled slowly, nodding. "Then let's do it right." She pulled out her phone, fingers hovering over the screen. The files were already uploaded. All she had to do was press send. A pause. Then, with a deep breath, she tapped the button. The email disappeared. The information was gone, sent to investigative journalists, government watchdogs, and whistleblower platforms. Within minutes, the first news alerts began popping up on her screen. The scandal was breaking. There was no stopping it now. Thomas watched the notifications flood in. "You just declared war on some very powerful people." Cassandra let out a quiet laugh. "They declared it first. I'm just making sure they don't win." Her phone buzzed. An unknown number. She hesitated before answering. A low, unfamiliar voice spoke. "You just made a lot of enemies, Wilson. Be careful." The line went dead. Cassandra lowered the phone slowly. She had expected this. The battle wasn't over. If anything, it had only just begun. She took another sip of her coffee, watching the city move outside the window. For the first time in weeks, she felt free. But she wasn't naive. The system wasn't done with her yet. Enjoyed the story? Hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss another thrilling episode.